Chapter 2. The Return of the Silent King. 52 million years before the return of the Silent King.
Father, why do you not speak to me? Did I do something wrong?
It was a memory. Cesarek felt as if he had run out of original thoughts after drifting aimlessly through the galaxy. For so many millennia, he had stood in one place on his observation deck, watching the stars, unmoving, unbreathing, and deathless. The others aboard the Song of Oblivion followed his command not to disturb him. They tended to the operation of the ship in shifts, and the only reason he knew any of them existed was because his planet-sized transport had not crashed into a star. But it made for poor conversation. So, he resorted to ones he remembered. In this one, it was his child who spoke to him, Cesarek's heir. If he survived long enough to outlive his sire. He did not, in the end. He did not make it to the furnaces. He died in Cesarek's arms as he carried him, bleeding from a tumor somewhere in his body. But that was not the moment Cesarek chose to remember. Cesarek could not construct the expression on his son's face. He could no longer recall faces, only death masks, which was disconcerting on a form so small. Still, it was his child. What father couldn't look past a face? And the face must have been compelling at the time, because Cesarek, the Silent King, spoke. "Have your tutors taught you of hecatic will?" Cesarek remembered himself asking. The child stepped back, shocked at suddenly being addressed. Then he bounded forward and stared up in wonder and excitement.
"Yes, father, it is the will of rulers. What we say is law."
"It is more than that," Cesarek said, choosing his words carefully. "What a king says is more than law. It is reality." The child tilted his head.
"So, I can say that the sky is made of blue candy and it becomes true? How?"
"Ah, that inquisitive age. He's been warned it was coming." "Your people will move the stars in heaven to make your will reality. For how can they contradict the word of the king? However," he knelt down, "would it be wise to declare the sky is made of blue candies?"
"I suppose not," the child said. "It would be difficult for people. They'd have to work so hard, and it would keep them from doing other important things, right?"
The desire for approval was so clear in his voice. It stung Cesarek that he could never fully give it. This could well be the last piece of wisdom he imparted through his words. The rest must be done by example. And that was a terribly distant thing. "This is why the monarch is silent, my child," he said. "For we are the highest of kings. Thus, our hecatic will is the most absolute. It must only be exercised when the need is great, and only with absolute wisdom." Cesarek didn't know whether his child truly understood. He suspected he didn't, but only because he was young. Cesarek had planted a seed. Experience would water it, and one day it would bloom into understanding.
"Thank you, father."
The child folded his fingers.
"But how do you know when it's important enough? How do you know when you have to speak?"
Cesarek did not respond. Present day. The Song of Oblivion was noisy. Cesarek stood on the same observation deck that had held him during his exile. But now, people disturbed him. His lich guards surrounded him, his cryptex and praetorians reported to him. Still, he watched the stars, while dispatching other pieces of his mind to sorting and storing the information being relayed to him. The stars looked familiar. Thanks to his enhanced sight, he could see the different radiation signatures, color spectrum shifts, and even the differences in burn patterns that made each one unique. He could see how they had changed. He could see how one star, new when he had begun his exile, was soon to die and consume its dozens of orbiting planets. He looked away, not sure he liked the omen. Two shadows stretched across the room to either side of him. He knew them without looking. The other members of the Triarchy, Hapatra, the Radiant, and Mesophet, the Shadowed Hand, his right and left arm. The hunched, monocular figures stepped into place, staring out at the void.
"The lords are beginning to arrive," Hapatra said. "All but a small number have responded to your summons."
"Forces have been deployed to correct the error of those who refused,"
Mesophet added.
"They await your orders."
Cesarek dipped his chin in acknowledgement. He did not like to use force this way. Every Necron lost was not only a tragedy, but a waste. He could not afford to be wasteful against an enemy that numbered in the trillions and was only growing. However, anything that threatened the unity of his empire was a threat. Better a few lost now than thousands in a civil war.
"There is the question of Mandragora," Hapatra said. "From them we have no word."
So, Imhotep had not answered. Cesarek knew how little regard the general had for him. If their positions were reversed, Cesarek's feelings might have been the same. But surely, Imhotep could be convinced when he saw the scope of the threat. He would understand the Necrons must be a unified force, or they would perish. Surely the galaxy would not be doomed by one Necron's pride. The Triarchy waited. Cesarek could have sped his chronosense to avoid the weight of anticipation, but he chose to let time pass as it would. This would be his last moment of peace for a long time. His last moment to turn back. Hatred flared inside him, hot and bright as the coming death of that star. The echo of malicious laughter and cold black eyes played in his mnemonic banks. He would not turn back. Not for anything in the universe. There was no need to ask if everything was ready. He had made his will known, and reality had bent around him, as it was meant to. So, he knew the precise moment the door behind him would slide open, and his Judicator Prime would step through and bow.
"I humble myself before the Triarchy to inform your magnificences that the lords are assembled. They await you in the Great Hall."
"Let us see who has remained loyal," Hapatra said.
"And those who seek oblivion,"
Mesophet added. Cesarek folded his hands behind his back. At long last, it was time for his empire to awaken. They called him the Thief of Solemnes, mostly behind his back, but a few were bold enough to say so to his face. Trazyn didn't think the title was fair. Where did one draw the line between theft and rescue? Would they rather he leave the history of the universe to rot or be destroyed? In some cases, probably yes, but that simply begged the question of what they wanted to hide. Sadly, transmographer Hurag did not seem in the mood to debate these finer philosophical points.
"Trazyn!"
The broad-shouldered cryptech shouted, not at all caring that they were in the middle of the great hall on the Song of Oblivion, nor that several overlords and cryptechs had turned their heads toward the commotion.
"Ah,
Hurag," Trazyn said with all the cheerfulness he could manage.
"It's been too long." "Not long enough. You have a lot of nerve showing yourself here.
He jabbed a long metal finger towards Trazen's chest.
I hope every loose article of the ship has been bolted down. A necessary precaution with you around. You wound me, Trazen replied. I know you're upset about the Time Splitter cloak. Upset does not begin to cover it. But I only meant to borrow it, and the circumstances were extenuating.
Necron nobility were whispering around them. Well, if Hurag meant to embarrass him, he was succeeding. Dropping his voice, Trazen said,
Is it really necessary to air the Nihilak court's affairs in such a public venue? Perhaps not, Hurag responded, also in a whisper. But if anyone doubted where you stood in relation to our court, they surely don't anymore. There will be no hiding behind our goodwill. You exhausted that resource by pillaging your own. I'll be back in the court's good graces eventually, you know. Your little scene will only reflect poorly on you. You think so?
Hurag pulled back, made a rude gesture, and stomped into the crowd. Glowing oculars stared at Trazen while he stood dumbfounded. He suddenly sympathized with his exhibits. A shiver ran up his spine as he heard a rasping laugh behind him. He should ignore it. Sadly, he was already turning towards the sound, so there was no way to play it off as if he hadn't noticed.
Orakan, he said, I see you're enjoying yourself.
I'm simply interested in how long you intend to clear up that minor misunderstanding.
Trazen narrowed his oculars. Orkan had always reminded him of an insect, with his thin limbs and sharp angles, though he had to admit, part of him preferred dealing with his old rival to dealing with an angry Hurag. There was a familiarity to his routine with Orkan, and it had been at least a century since either of them had tried to kill each other, so they were on relatively good terms these days.
This whole mess is your fault, you know,
Trazen said. Now that the show was over, the attention of the crowd had wandered elsewhere. His arguments with Orkan were not nearly so novel.
I only borrowed the Time Splitter cloak after you kept cheating the timeline during our court proceedings.
I have no idea what you are talking about.
Oh, don't be so humble, my friend. You know as well as I.
Wonderful,
said a new voice, dripping with sarcasm.
You two have found each other already.
Trazen flinched at the sight of Executioner Phileas. She didn't have her scythe in hand, but the Praetorian carried herself like a weapon. Nothing about her brought back good memories. At least he was sure he hadn't done anything to earn her full wrath. Fairly sure, anyway. She stood pointedly between the two of them.
For two supposed bitter rivals, you certainly can't seem to avoid each other.
He started it.
Trazen folded his arms. Childish, maybe, but Phileas had a point. It really should have been easier to avoid unpleasant interactions here. He had observed the scale of the hall when he first entered, but it truly was astounding. The ceilings must have been 2 cat high, covered with lights that looked like stars. It might well be an accurate astrological map. Orkan would know, but Trazen wasn't about to ask. They walked upon smooth, seamless blackstone. Blackstone obelisk formed 2 parallel lines in the middle of the chamber, leading to a tiered dais, raised high above their heads. For some reason, sound did not echo in here. There was atmosphere, so it should have been a cacophony of whispers and footfalls. But the chamber was solemn in its silence. So, the boom that resonated through the hall was shocking enough to set Trazen's reactor spinning. It came from the dais. Nearly every head turned to see the Judicator Prime standing above them, slamming his ornate glaive against the blackstone floor. It was louder than it should have been, Trazen thought. Was there something in the atmosphere to control sonic distortions?
Assembled! Hail the return of Sazarek, last and greatest of the Silent Kings! Prostrate yourselves before him! Prostrate yourselves before the Triarchy!
With a flash of green light, the dais was suddenly full. Two hunched figures to the right and left, Hapatra and Mesophet. Hapatra's oculars scanned lazily above their heads, but Trazyn had the disconcerting feeling that Mesophet was watching them. Watching him. Between them, a bronze figure stood. Even without the massive crown atop his head, he was tall. A long cloak billowed from his shoulders, so light and fine it appeared to be fabric. Only its shine betrayed that it was metal. Trazyn could hardly believe what he was seeing. He should have been prepared. It was why he'd come here after all, but somehow he had not quite been prepared to stand in Cesarek's presence after more than 60 million years. The Silent King had come back. Trazyn barely had time to process this before he saw 7 figures in a line standing on the next step of the dais. Gold masks covered their faces. Silver cloaks hid their bodies. Below them were Lichguard, but there was something different about them. An intelligence behind their oculars, not to mention their pristine black and gold chassis. The Stellar Scythes. The Silent King's personal guard. Rumor had it that they had been given more mental enhancements than most overlords, to go along with their martial prowess and blackstone armor. Trazyn had almost thought their existence a myth. A thrill ran through his core. He was seeing many interesting things today.
Pharaons, overlords, renowned scholars, Hapatra said, her voice calm but clear. You see before you the Triarchy reunited. The Silent King returned. Stand with us now.
We ask all assembled to retake your vows,
Mesophet said.
Dedicate yourself once again to your king, to your people, to your glorious purpose.
The stakes are higher than ever, perhaps even higher than the war in heaven.
The crowd balked at that. An indignant murmur traveled the room from front to back, unhampered by the sound manipulation surrounding them. Then the Silent King extended his hand, and everything went quiet. He pointed upwards. As if dragged by an invisible cord, Trazyn's head tilted up. At first he saw nothing but the star-patterned ceiling. Then a green orb appeared. It appeared large, even considering the distance. Something moved inside it. Trazyn froze. It can't be. A hideous roar tore through the great hall. Hands went to cover autoreceptors, but it was useless. It was like the sound was rattling inside Trazyn's head. He looked next to him and saw Orkin twisting away from the cry. Even Phileas's hard stance faltered. Has he gone insane? Trazyn said. No one replied. He doubted anyone had heard him. But it took a madman to bring a winged hive tyrant into the largest assembly of Necron nobility in millennia. The beast beat against the walls of its prison. Claws scraped the green force field. Wings beat against it. Flesh and muscle pulled tight across ribs, and bones flexed with a strength Trazyn was all too familiar with. Saliva dripped from its jaws. Then the force field vanished. The beast shrieked and fell before it managed to extend its wings and catch itself in the air. The crowd backed away, those closest reaching for their pocket dimensions where they kept their weapons. But no staffs or scythes appeared. Trazyn attempted to reach for his empathic obliterator, but he only grasped empty air. Somehow, Cesarek had disarmed them all. The hive tyrant dove for the nearest victim. Cesarek pulled his towering, double-bladed staff from nowhere and hurled it. The scepter of eternal glory pierced the hive tyrant through the back. The creature screamed, acidic blood showering the unlucky Necrons below. A circle cleared as Cesarek leapt after his weapon, sailing through the air, cloak fluttering behind. He grabbed the shaft of his scepter and yanked it free as the hive tyrant thrashed, attempting to lock its teeth around the Silent King. The seconds the two wrestled in the air seemed like years. Trazyn's oculars were locked on the battle. He could not have fled even if he had thought to. Cesarek's fingers wrapped around the bone of the hive tyrant's wing. A snap rang out above the crowd, and the hive tyrant screamed, plummeting to the ground as the silent king plunged his scepter deeper into its chest. The creature died in a pool of steaming acidic blood, seconds after it hit the blackstone floor. That was little comfort. Trazen felt cold. Not that he had sensed a change in ambient temperature, but as if ice had settled in his core and in his engrams. Because during the battle, he had seen the hive tyrant's eyes, black orbs that drew him in and filled his head with hatred. Trazen had the terrible feeling other things had been looking at him through those black eyes, and those things hated him just as much.
"You see what it is we seek to fight," Hapatra said. "Incomprehensible numbers of these Tyranids are coming. The Silent King has seen it. He has broken his mournful exile solely to warn you and lead you to victory against the greatest threat our empire has ever faced. Will you stand with him?"
"We will stand with him."
One of the figures in the masks shed their cloak and cast aside the face covering. Asmotep, a pharaoh who had followed Cesaric since the time of flesh. He had finally been rewarded for his stubborn fidelity. Next to him stood the midnight blue form of Thoek, pharaoh of the Charnavog dynasty, and beside him, Trazen almost adjusted his oculars. The third pharaoh glittered with gold and turquoise, his chassis almost lithe in its construction. Krispek, Trazen's own pharaoh, even if Trazen was no longer welcome at the Nihilic court. His hand curled into a fist. Had the rest of the dynasty known they'd been pledged to Cesaric before even coming here? Dead gods, what if he had refused the Praetorian summons? Cesaric removed his scepter from the corpse of the hive tyrant and cast off blood with a flick of the weapon. The stellar scythes and the newly revealed pharaohs parted as he climbed back to his place on the dais, cloak trailing behind him.
"Urakan," Trazen whispered, "I'm curious about something."
"Is now really the time?"
the astromancer hissed. Phileas glared down at him.
"Trazen, I swear—"
"It's just that, Urakan, you're here, which means you answered the Praetorian's call. Now, perhaps I'm missing something, but I have not seen your master anywhere, and I find it hard to believe that you would be here without the Stormlord's approval."
A staticky noise that might have been a chuckle escaped Urakan's throat.
"How unusually astute of you."
"Now that begs the question," Trazen said. "Where is your pharaoh?"
Urakan pressed a finger to his forehead. Trazen and Phileas waited, nearly as focused on him as they were the next words of the Triarchy.
3,
Urakan said. Apatra spread her arms.
"Who will stand against the great devourer? 2, who will unite to defend our empire once again?"
Trazen's eyes darted behind him.
"Urakan?"
"Who will once again pledge their fealty to the Silent King?"
Urakan's ocular shone.
1.
With a peal of thunder, the massive doors behind them swung open. One ripped clear of whatever hinges held it in place. It fell, nearly crushing a small group of cryptex hanging to the back of the chamber. Wind tore through the hall, which should have been impossible on a ship, even one as large as the Song of Oblivion. An object sailed through the air. Phileas drew her war scythe, poised to intercept, until its arc brought it within view. She recoiled as it landed and skidded across the floor. The severed head of a Triarch Praetorian. A room full of Necrons gasping is not a pleasant sound. It was as if two saw blades were being dragged across each other in an infinite echo chamber, then passed through a distorted amplifier. It was not something heard often. Few things were able to shock 100 immortal lords at once. Trazen grimaced when he saw what had been capable of such a feat.
Imhotep, the Storm Lord, Pharaoh of the Saltec dynasty and Nightmare incarnate, strode into the hall.
He had technically disarmed himself, but the general was never without weapons. Like his hand, which would have looked right at home on a prime specimen of the flayed ones. He pointed one of those long, clawed fingers at the silent king.
So, the coward comes crawling back.